right, good morning, everybody. We can go ahead and get started. It is still morning. And I've got the pleasure to introduce to you all Kurt Christensen. Now, Kurt is a senior engineering manager with the R&D group at Nubank, a multinational fintech company based in Brazil. He has worked as a software developer since 1995 and has also worked as an Agile coach since 2003. And I think I've known him in both capacities. On everything from small teams to startups to large-scale Agile transformations. Let's give it up for Kurt Christensen.
Hey, thanks. Can you probably hear me okay? Thumbs up? Right on. Welcome. Thank you very, very much for coming. I totally appreciate your coming here. You clearly don't know that Tara Scott is doing a talk on psychological safety, which is probably really good. All right. Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. As Steve mentioned, I'm currently working as a senior engineering manager at Nubank. Nubank is based out of Sao Paulo, Brazil. I haven't thought about process in a long time. So everything I'm about to say today, you should take with like a pound of salt. The last time I had an official Agile coaching gig was about, I think 2017 or something like that. So feel free to discount anything I'm going to say. I will say, and this is kind of like a little bit of foreshadowing of some of the salty remarks that will come later, is that I think it's somewhat telling that I'm working at a place where we're running as fast and hard as we can, and we don't really talk about process a whole lot. We essentially have larger problems to deal with. I started at the beginning of this year. We had 40 million customers. Right now we have 71 million customers. Whether or not we're Agile is the least of our problems right now. I'm kind of a recovering Agile coach. If anything, I kind of got burned out from it. Anybody here feeling burned out as an Agile coach? You won't admit it because you have potential employers here. Let me ask, who are you? Can I have a show of hands, anybody who considers themselves Agile coach, Scrum Master, or project manager? Okay, mostly, right on. Engineers or testers? Okay. What about folks with an engineering background? Oh, okay, right on, some. Anybody from the other worlds, finance, HR, legal, anything like that? Nobody. One, couple. Cool. This will mostly be directed at the Scrum Masters, Agile coaches in the room, but hopefully some of this at least resonates with everyone here. The engineering representation is a little bit light, so that's good for me. It means I can pad all the numbers, and most of you won't know. So my agenda for today is this. Some of these things you will know. I ask you to bear with me. I want to set some context and talk about where all of this Agile stuff came from. The theme of the talk is 20 plus years of Agile. How did we get here, and where do we go next? And so I want to treat this a little bit like kind of a retrospective, where we are today, what has worked well, what has not worked well, and where we might go from here. I'm going to try to go through this rapidly enough that I would like to hear your feedback for my salty remarks. So I'm going to try to leave a little bit of time at the end for Q&A. So we're at the tail end of what has been 20 plus years of Agile. If you were at the previous talk, you heard sort of a personal history of this, but the broad history is that the Agile software development movement came from, really was sort of reactionary to heavyweight methodologies. I'm seeing a lot of people here with gray hair like mine, but also a lot of folks who look younger than me. So if all you've ever known is Agile software development, it might be hard for you to appreciate where some of this came from, especially from the developer's perspective. As somebody who's spent a lot of years computer programming myself, I'm always a little bit amazed when I get pushback from developers like, I can't believe I have to go to the stand-up meeting every day. That's 15 minutes. There's this part of me that just kind of wants to shake them and go, do you understand what we had to do before this? You want to spend months in a room writing UML sequence diagrams? Because I did that. And that sucked way worse than stand-up meetings. There were a lot of heavyweight things at the time. rational unified process, which incidentally was not inherently heavyweight, but was heavyweight as practiced. There were things that that weren't really quite methodologies, but influenced methodologies, things like the capability maturity model. Anybody here familiar with the capability maturity model? Remember that? You hear less about it now. Sort of the North Star for the capability maturity model was the Space Shuttle Avionics Software Group. One thing I always think is funny about that is the average code output of the Space Shuttle Avionics Software Group amounted to about 2,000 lines in the career of a PhD. So if you think that's a North Star for your business to go after, good luck with that. So there was a reaction of a lot of people that got together and actually formed a conference around Kent Beck's extreme programming methodology. The first conference was in Sardinia. I did not personally attend, but I knew some folks who did. It was about 150 people. That was 2000. That was actually the year before the Agile Manifesto. The Agile Manifesto felt like a revolution in 2001. We were going to do something totally different. We're going to make it really lightweight. We're going to make it really different. And then that same year, the immediate thought of a lot of folks was, how the hell are we going to monetize this? And in came Scrum certification, and there were internal politics that caused Schwaber to break off in 2009 and form a separate group. But of course, the certification was just a whole new set of certifications. And then Dean Leffingwell introduced a scaled Agile framework in 2011, which, did that come with a bunch of certifications? Oh, surely it did. So where are we today? We still have the Agile Manifesto. Scrum won, little a Agile lost. That might be okay. We'll get to that later. But there's some of the things that we talk about now is, I'm sure there's a lot of talks here today that have an emphasis on product-centric processes, which is probably an improvement over what we've had in the past. Some other groups are practicing Lean or Kanban. Can I have a quick show of hands? How many people here are in a group right now where you'd say they're practicing Scrum? Overwhelmingly so. How many people have groups where you're practicing Lean or Kanban? Oh, interesting, right? Cool. More of a flow-based model, courtesy of the Poppendieeks, who brought us Lean software development using manufacturing as a metaphor rather than house construction, which seems to be the dominant metaphor. And there are some interesting offshoots that people are talking about that are kind of like one step to the side of the Agile community. People working on dojos, trying to kind of like institutionalize or formalize or regularize how we train people to prepare for using Agile software development methodology, and also sort of related issues like psychological safety. So going into a retrospective mode, thinking about what worked, I'd like to start by giving everybody a couple minutes. I want you to talk to a person sitting next to you, and since it looked like most people here were active practitioners, I'd like you to share what are some things from Agile software development methodology that on your team or in your career has worked for you. I'll give you 2 minutes starting now. All right, I'm going to interrupt everybody. The duck was a shout out to, anybody recall David Hussman's duck? A little shout out to David Hussman. Basically everything I learned about Agile software development and software development in general, I learned from Dave. So I'm here to share all of his biases. He's back from the grave just for today. Let me share some things first. Let me just start by telling you some things that from my perspective have worked and why. As probably most of you in the room, we've seen Agile processes make a difference and actually work. Basic Scrum Kanban is mostly functional-ish in most environments, problems aside. I would say we successfully displaced documentation-heavy, big, huge processes like waterfall for the most part. As many problems as exist with Agile methods as practiced, it's better than what we had, generally speaking, I would say. We have a vibrant community that continues to grow 20 years on. I think that's a huge success. A thing that's not talked about as much that I think is an important aspect is that we actually at least have a discussion of what done means, which I think is a huge improvement. Since I mentioned Dave before, I'll mention a story that he had that I always loved. So he did a lot of work with a guy named Jamie Tinglestead. And I met Jamie at Dave's funeral, actually. So this is a weird place to ask the question, but I couldn't resist. And I said, Jamie, I've heard, Dave told me this story for years, that he said that, because Jamie's like a CTO at MarketWatch or something like that, or Big Charts before it got acquired by MarketWatch. And Dave always told me that you had this thing that you would do where anytime a developer would come into your office and say, hey, we're done with X, Jamie would always go, that's great. What's left? And they would always have an answer. And so having those kind of discussions and at least formalizing around what done or capital D done means in a particular environment, I think is a healthy, important thing that seems to have been catalyzed by the Agile movement in a way that didn't quite exist before. And as I mentioned before, that as salty as I am about the certification process, it may be that the certification process of Scrum and SAFe was necessary in order for it to be adopted by larger organizations. So I'm hesitant to call that a success, but I do think it is a qualified success. Another thing that I think has been successful that probably nobody in this room could have really anticipated, myself included, I don't think it was obvious that remote Agile was going to work. And the pandemic seems to have proved that out. We have stand-ups via Zoom meetings, we have planning sessions via Zoom meetings, and it all seems to kind of be working, actually, which is a little bit amazing. Certainly, some of the tools that have emerged, like Miro, have helped. And obviously, it certainly helps that Zoom actually works. If video conferencing software had been like it was 10 years ago, the pandemic would have been a lot worse. Now, before I go on to this, I want to ask all of you, what did I miss? What are some things that worked, that have worked for you from the Agile space that you did not just see on that list? So, retrospectives. We didn't have retrospectives before, and that's a huge win. Even if you do nothing else, sometimes you get pushback from people about doing retrospectives, and you're kind of incredulous, right? Like, really? Like, there's no value in talking about like if things are okay? No, and I think therapists are bad too. Like, all right. What else was not on that list? Stable teams? Can you elaborate on that a little?
We put teams together and we bring the work to them. And they get to work together for you.
I agree. I did not include that. And like cross-functional teams. It used to be very much like the engineers were here and the testers were here and the product managers were here. And yeah, I agree. I forgot to include that. And that's a big one. Any others? Can you elaborate just a little? Sure, because it's encouraged an incremental approach that we didn't have before. It used to be like, well, the dot, get on the train, the dot release is in 12 months. And we've kind of moved beyond that. I want to cover one more. Yeah, sorry, you're right there.
A lot of the past is focusing on a minimum viable product and saying no to a lot of stuff, and say yes to something, and then avoiding
I agree with that. That's sometimes a lot of teams have a problem doing that, but I think if you organize it well, I hesitate to say correctly, I think if you organize it well, you can certainly get there. There's probably others, but in the interest of time, I'm going to pause, and I want to move on to the next question. And again, I'm going to ask you to take a couple minutes and discuss with your neighbor what has not worked. What have been your problems with Agile methods specifically, either in your career or at your current job? I'll give you 2 minutes, go. The duck has spoken. All right, enough knowledge sharing. No more information. What didn't work? I'm going to start by giving you my own salty opinions, and then I want to hear yours. We chose standardization and we lost the spirit. If you read the Agile Manifesto, it's not what it was about, people. It was not about some huge certification process. It was meant to be adaptive to your needs. And your needs are not dictated by a process. And dressing it up as saying like, well, it's not a process, it's a framework, is a little bit like lipstick on a pig. Because it's possible, yes, you can treat it as a framework. Yes, you can treat it as a bag of tools. Certainly that is how you should do it. The person Ken who spoke previously to me, certainly is a skilled practitioner who would apply it that way. But it's not what happens in a lot of organizations. In a lot of organizations, you have the conversation of, are we doing Agile right? Are we doing Scrum right? Are we doing Safe right? Who cares? It is not an interesting conversation. You should not be using your process to test your product, or you should not be using your product to test your process. That's a quote I heard during an Agile transformation that I was part of during 2007 through 9. VP guy says, it feels like we're using our product to test our process instead of using process to build our product. Often becomes the case. How many, show of hands real quick, how many have had a conversation of, or had to be engaged in a conversation with, are we doing Agile right? That's a lot of people. Were those, let's see, another show of hands. How many of those were super constructive conversations? It's kind of like talking about story points. As soon as you start talking about story points, oh, you just want to hit yourself in the head with a brick. Estimation as a whole is a complicated discussion, and if we have time during the Q&A, we can also get into that as well. I did not include estimation here. I'm sure it's going to come up when I ask. But another thing that didn't quite work and why is as part of the certification process, there was sort of a whole snake oil industry around it, And I say that as somebody who was a part of it. I live in a house and my kids were fed being an Agile coach. So I get it, and I do think that there's a lot of value we can add, but there's also a lot of noise in that space. And we've sort of, speaking of lipstick on a pig, we've kind of changed some things and we don't talk about Agile process anymore. We use the word product a lot. We use the word product instead of project. Feels like the same thing. Another thing that I think is challenging is SAFe notwithstanding, we still don't really know how to scale it up past a particular team. I mentioned before that one of the successes of Agile is look, basically if you're doing vanilla kind of Scrum, Kanban, something like that with a project team, you got a dozen people, maybe even up to 20 people, something like that, working on a particular product or maybe even like a tightly focused program. Basically, you can kind of paint by numbers and you're going to have some measure of success. As soon as you scale up past that, well, SAFe tries to address that, right, with a framework. I think what I the bias that I inherited from Dave Hussman that I share strongly myself to this day is that you're trying to create a framework and trying to standardize something right at the point where standardization isn't interesting anymore. Like trying to standardize a process for company X, which might be a retailer, compare that with a bank, where I'm at right now. Those are wildly different markets. They're wildly different companies that have wildly different cultures. Why would I dream of using the exact same process to do project portfolio management, product management, so on and so forth? One of the biggest problems with focusing on are we doing Agile right? And certifications tend to lead us down this path of wanting to sort of follow the straight and narrow and follow some sort of well-worn path that is understood, that is in line with what I learned in my certification classes and what I've been told to apply, is that if you're not adapting to your needs, that's not a success measure. If your team has the exact same process today that it did a year ago, that's not good. The whole point of it was to be adaptive. That was the whole idea. I suggest, I referenced the Agile Manifesto. But these are some things that, I did want to mention one thing, my last note, that we're still talking about it. In some ways, while it's on the one hand, the positive is that we have a vibrant community. On the other hand, the fact that we're still sort of trying to figure out how to do Agile 20 plus years later, it's kind of one of my rants about for the developers in the room, the fact that you have to talk about it all the time is not a success measure. There's something about anytime you have to use some sort of tool and it's you have to talk, we keep talking about this tool, it means that there's something wrong with the tool. Jira too, for that matter. Sorry, this is tangential. I will say that more people would be happier with Jira if they understood that it is not a project management tool. It is a tool for creating a project management tool for your company. They gave you a developer tool and sold it as a product. If you understood it was a developer tool, it'd be better off. But what did I miss? What are some things that are not working for you? Story points. He said it. Anybody else? Story points, estimation, issue? Estimation. Yeah, you were going to say? I know, it's one of the things that drove me crazy about the community early on. As soon as the story point notion came out, it was well, no, we work in these dimensionless units, and you just sort of could hear all the project managers crying, because it's somebody's turning them into hours. Because I guarantee you the CFO isn't looking at story points. Somebody had a hand up over there? Oh, sorry, yes, absolutely. Oh, yeah. The issue was around story points and estimation. Kyle, you must have an opinion about story points and estimation. You know, dude, I once worked at a place where it had one of those motivational posters up, and the motivational poster said, "I don't care which direction we're going as long as it's forward." And I thought, that is the most depressing thing I've ever seen in my life. Other things that you're experiencing, that problems with Agile methods that you experience today that are not on this list. Yeah?
Yes, kind of going off with the story point, it's really hard for like project managers to adapt and like place the fit into Agile. A lot of conflict between PMO, product, and
Oh, do you mean kind of like, we're doing Agile now, here's the Scrum Master, you're the project manager, and it's like trying to figure that out? Yeah, that. You were going to say?
I would echo that with when they're saying make these teams agile, but also I still want my scorecard.
Right, it's everything, that's a classic anti-pattern. And some of these things, maybe it's not fair to tag Agile methods, but it definitely becomes, everything's additive. We're not going to throw out any of the process, we're just going to add this on top. True. You were going to say?
Under your standardization item up there, a lot of companies seem like, as part of that, it's kind of like one size fits all, like all teams. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I'm concerned about with the idea that every team should be Agile. Finance, ops, legal, everybody's going to follow an Agile method. It's like, well, I don't know, does that make sense? I keep coming back to, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Being Agile is not an interesting question. What is the problem we're trying to solve is an interesting question to answer. In the back, you were going to say?
Yeah, adding roles, adding complexity hasn't really helped at all, even scaling. It's actually inhibited flow, inhibited value delivery, and the decreased focus on, let's say, value delivery and cycle time and throughput of that, and increased focus on getting, I would say, disempowering almost the development team by adding, or just removing some of the responsibility and giving it to some manager, right, or some I feel like that's something that hasn't been working well.
Yeah, essentially like proliferation of roles as we try to scale. So, I'm sorry, against the wall, you were going to say?
I just wanted to add that velocity metrics at scale is not working for me. I mean, I think that the idea of Agile, when you're trying to scale it out, part of the biggest problem with that is the idea that you can measure an engineering team's output with data points. And, to me, they make that mistake with every process that comes out. Six Sigma is the same. I mean, it's like, I'm sure we can all compare the processes and how this needs data. But I think in Agile lends itself, particularly to the velocity concept, that's still, it's still such a waste of energy.
The velocity can definitely be a huge waste, and I think often is. It's one of those things, again, that it's like, well, it wouldn't have to be, right? One of the best jobs I ever had was Agile coaching the Siemens rail automation group in Minnetonka, and it was sort of like the first transformation. It was a dream job as a coach because they were all so frustrated with their previous project that they were all like ready for it. They were like, dude, you tell us to wear clown suits and do dances and we'll do it. We'll try anything. So they were all like really open for it. It was like, okay, we're gonna go into a room and pair program together. It was like, it sounds like a stupid idea, but we'll try it. And they had evolved to the point where we had a really great story writing process where we had stories on index cards, and our sort of ultimate product manager, we had gotten to the point where just sort of naturally we had sort of gravitated towards a story was about a week's worth of development work. So he said, you know, it's been a year, and now I can sort of get a sense of what the bid for the contract is going to be just by how thick the index card deck is. And that was a great situation, but it's not common. Typically, you have a lot of crazy discussions around velocity, and there was in the previous talk, there was a quote by Peter Drucker, and the classic quote by Peter Drucker is, you can't manage what you can't measure. But the addendum to that is, be careful what you measure, because that's what you get. And that's definitely true for a lot of us in the Agile software development space. We became super metrics focused, and so everything becomes about kind of gaming the system. You have lots of discussions around splitting stories to decide how much points you get credit for in this sprint versus the next sprint. How is this constructive if we're going to be product-centric, how is that constructive to your product development process? What problem are you trying to solve? You're trying to solve sort of a middle management problem that your salespeople, your senior executives, certainly your customers, probably don't care about. So this is all very cynical and salty. And I could just end right now. It's like, yeah, you should go to a different conference. Doesn't work. Just give up. But hopefully we've learned some things, and we've seen that some things were successful from this 20-plus year experiment, and we'd like to be able to improve in the spirit of a retrospective, right? What are our action items going forward from the things that don't work? Let's start with what success could look like. This is sort of a corollary to, I have lots of conversations at work that revolve around what is the actual problem we're trying to solve. I work with all these, the closure community, and they're all acolytes of a guy named Rich Hickey, who's super smart, and Rich Hickey's thing was he had a Jesuit education, and he's like very into the Socratic method, and it's like, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Let's get to the root problem. But I think a different variation of that is imagining what the perfect future world might look like, and then trying to work backwards from that to see what could we do to possibly get there. Where do we want to be in some number of months or years, and how do we get there? For one thing, our incentives would be aligned with our goals. When I say incentives, I mean primarily financial compensation. Here's a quick tangent. Any folks in here have done tours of duty at any of the major retailers in town? I remember working there like 15 plus years ago, and Amazon had not quite eaten everybody's lunch yet. And I remember a common conversation was like, well, we have an online presence plus we have brick and mortar stores, so Amazon will never fully be able to dethrone us. Except, what was the synergy between the brick and mortar stores and the online element? It didn't exist. Why didn't it exist? Was it a technological constraint? I see a particular target person who I'm pointing at, and Eric, you tell me if I'm misrepresenting this, but as I recall, the real success of the Cartwheel project fundamentally was the first thing that Elwin did was get the executives aligned around how they would be compensated for sales that could be attributed to the application. That was the real success. Aligning incentives, that was something a retailer had not done before. And then they were able to do something that was synergistic between the two. It wasn't a technology problem, it was an incentive problem. And I find that's often true with process discussions that we have, is that it's not really a process problem, the problem is that the incentives are misaligned. In a perfect world, the organizational structure we have would also be aligned with that. Oftentimes I see processes being used as some sort of way to gloss over or to hide problems that are fundamentally just bad org structures. We would want to focus on product and profit and customer happiness over our process. Processes should be just a tool. We shouldn't be fixated on it. We should be able to sort of think about it when we have to and put it away when we're not thinking about it. You know, I've never been to a conference on Milwaukee cordless drills. I have one, and it works. I haven't had to spend the last 20 years talking about it. It just sort of does what it's supposed to do. Another piece that sometimes gets pushed aside that is very important is engineering excellence. Here's an anecdote, also from about 15 years ago. If you looked at a list of the top 10 most visited websites, at the time one of them was still Craigslist. So you had Yahoo, Google, MSN, some stuff like that, all of whom had thousands of employees. In the mid-2000s, Craigslist had 20 employees. This is before AWS. Think about that for a second. Think about the amount of traffic they were managing with 20 employees. So clearly there was engineering excellence happening at Craigslist. So one step forward could be to go back to basics. This is not applicable for everybody. This does not necessarily apply if you're trying to make this work with 20 different teams working on a large program. But for small individual teams where your product's pretty focused, or if you're working on something that's purely internal, like I once worked at a bank where I was working on a compliance application. It was only ever gonna have 20 users that were in the compliance department. There wasn't a need for a heavyweight process. We could just focus on what is the problem that we're trying to solve. And that is not the same thing as trying to do Agile right. One question to ask if you're thinking about modifying your process is to even ask, should you even be having a process discussion? Or do you have a different problem? Is the problem with engineering? Is the problem your org structure? Is the problem that your incentives are misaligned? One thing I'll add too, especially since most of you are Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, and maybe possibly don't have an engineering background, I want to say something, which is that it is 100% true that you do not need to have an engineering background to be in leadership of an engineering group. I will say that when I hear people say that, it tends to be a rationalization. And certainly it will never hurt you to learn more about the grist that goes into the mill. At a minimum, I would encourage all people in Agile coaching, Scrum Master, project management positions, at a minimum nowadays in today's world, at least learn a little bit more about the Amazon Web Services world that most of you probably live in. Maybe that's Google Cloud, maybe that's Azure for some of you, but most of us are operating in a cloud space right now, or at least many people are operating in cloud space. At a minimum, learn some of that to learn sort of like what the engineering options are, and especially to learn about sort of like how those things are, like the cost structure around some of those things, because the costs in the cloud will eat you alive. It's the biggest, one of the 20 most important problems where I work right now. We're trying to manage hypergrowth, and for a long time it was like just throw more resources at it, and then you get to 70 million customers, and you go, our AWS bills are pretty big. Big enough for the board of directors to notice. So what do we do about that? All of this to say is that I think to be successful in the future, particularly as you're trying to scale, rather than reach for safe, rather than reach for some framework, rather than reach for another recipe, I have a worse answer for you. A more challenging, hopefully maybe possibly more exciting answer for you, which is that we do not need to be process practitioners, we need to be process designers. And the design job never goes away. As you grow, as your product changes, as your customers change, as your market changes, you're going to continually have to revisit that process over time. The framework might help. The framework will not save you. You have to take ownership of understanding what you're doing and why you're doing it. What is the problem you are trying to solve? Aligning incentives is a big part of this. Again, I mentioned some incentives are sort of soft. You know, they're like, well, we have this business unit has goals, this other business unit has goals. They usually tend to come down to some sort of compensation. And I will say that incentives, as I mentioned before with the anecdote, incentives are stronger than process. There's the notion of culture eat strategy, incentives eat process. Incentives really eat everything else. Where incentives are aligned, your process can help. Where they're not aligned, process isn't gonna fix it. And especially where possible, consider executive BU level compensation. That's where you really see some of the biggest friction. The brutal truth is for most of us, myself included, those tend to be conversations that you don't get to have. The best you can do, as many of you have probably experienced as sort of an Agile practitioner, especially if you're a contractor and you go into some organization, about the best you can do is kind of hold up a mirror and say, this is where we're at. This is happening because this person gets $1 million check if this happens, and this person gets $1 million check if this happens, and these two things are an exclusive or. You can then decide what to do. Part of designing process is designing the organization. I know everybody trots out Conway's Law. I'm going to do it too. The idea that the software systems you build reflect the organization that builds it. I read a good anecdote from Martin Fowler, one of the Agile Manifesto signatories, who said this new architect started at a company, and they explained, like, well, we've got these 6 different teams around the globe. And he said, I've just made my first architectural decision about the system we're going to build. It's going to have 6 submodules. I don't know what they are, but that's the starting point, assuming you can't change the organization. One thing I will say, though, is to keep an eye out and to look for what other social patterns exist beyond this. And you want to try to, you can't fight these things. They happen, they're reality. You can either leverage it and use it in your favor, or you can spend your life trying to fight it. Process really is often just a hack to deal with suboptimal org structures. It's better to fix the org structure if you can. Now, fix the org structure. Again, it kind of depends on your pay grade, right? Maybe you get to have that conversation, maybe you don't. Maybe you are, in fact, using process as a hack to deal with a bad org structure because it's the best you can do. In that case, just go back to basic principles and think, what is the problem that I'm trying to solve, and focus on that. There's just a couple of little things that I want to add in here that are a little bit orthogonal, but I want to mention. One is that we don't do enough learning in this community from other disciplines. Organizational psychology, anthropology, political science, people who have thought about how do groups of people interact with one another, and we should learn more from those people. At some of these past conferences we have had back in the day, early days of Agile Day Twin Cities, when I think it was still called like Agile Palooza, and version 1 hosted it. We had like anthropologists and some other people speak, and we should kind of do more of that. We should seek that out. Another thing I'm going to make a pitch for that nobody has ever listened to me for once. Not one time has anybody ever taken this advice, but I want to throw it out there just in case there's any receptive listeners right now, which is that oftentimes we hire technical writers. We should hire librarians. Do you know there are people, you know, master of library science is a thing. It's an academic discipline. They think about how to collate, organize information, how to get the right information to people. Why do we not have these people working for corporations managing our documentation? Oh, the tech writers will do it. That's not what they do. That is not what they do. Every non-trivial sized organization should have a librarian who helps manage the documentation and tells us what documentation we actually need for our products and for our processes. None of you are going to listen. Nobody's ever listened to me say that, but I'm going to throw it out there anyways. The last thing I want to say is because, or one of the last points I want to make is, fundamentally we're involved with building software. It's a technical activity. Engineering matters. We can talk about process all day long. Process won't fix bad engineering. Process can help ameliorate the effects of bad engineering. They can help make bad engineering more exposed, but it's not going to fix it by itself. It should also make you question the process that we use. Where did extreme programming come from? Extreme programming actually came from Kent Beck looking at the cost versus change curve and realizing that technology had changed it. It had started to flatten the curve. And that if that was the case, we didn't necessarily need to do big design up front. We could be more adaptive. Well, since then, the cloud has come. Development is fundamentally different in AWS land than it was when we were all developers working on our own machines, writing something that was fundamentally a process running on a single server rather than hugely distributed systems. Now that we have hugely distributed systems, obviously we would have a totally different process from what we used before to build that software, right? No, we keep trying to use the exact same process. Why have we not adapted? Why is there not something new? In cloud world, flexibility and resiliency matter the most. These are different, somewhat different considerations than we might have had when we were more focused on performance. And the other thing that I want to mention is that engineering goals for your group should be right-sized. Despite what I just said, a lot of times engineers, especially in your engineering team, will be very focused on, oh, it has to be scalable, it has to be flexible. Well, for how many users? I once spent a lot of time and a lot of somebody else's money building an enterprise Java Beans solution that was going to be like infinitely scalable for what ultimately amounted to an app that was never going to have more than about 20 concurrent users. It would have been better for them if I had just lit the money on fire. At least they would have saved the time. I'm going to close with a couple of notes. These are all things that I think are valuable reading if you're not familiar with it. At the end of the day, I still think the only really valuable book on Agile is Kent Beck's Extreme Programming Explained. I also encourage you to check out the Checklist Manifesto. In terms of engineering knowledge that non-engineers should at least be aware of, highly encourage the book Release It by Michael Nygaard. And if you can still find him, I also highly recommend Dave Hussman's old video series on cutting an Agile groove. With that, I see I only have 30 seconds left, so I did not leave enough time for Q&A officially, but I'm not going anywhere, so if people want to ask some questions, I'm happy to take them.
That's
here, I'll pass the mic around.
Any questions before we go? All right. Thank you very much. Any questions, or everybody heading out for lunch? If anybody wants to stick around, I'll field questions. Kyle. What is my biggest surprise 20 years in? That it was widely adopted. I think that was my biggest surprise, that it was widely adopted. When we were doing extreme programming with teams in the year 2000, I would not have imagined that it was going to become the norm, or that something like it was going to become the norm. You know, that surprised me. Anybody else? Hey, thanks a lot for your time, everybody.